Are we living in a parallel universe, or have voters moved to support both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and President-elect Donald Trump?
The New York Congresswoman, who is known for being a member of the progressive leftist squad, was surprised to learn that many in her district swung toward Trump this election, while also at the same time supporting her.
AOC took to Instagram last week to ask her supporters about their decision. In since-expired Instagram stories, a lot of voters cited their decision as based upon what they saw as Democrats abandoning the working class. There was also a lot of dissatisfaction with establishment politicians. So, is this the beginning of a 2028 Trump-AOC ticket? What do you think, Robby?
I doubt that very much. And look, I'm very critical of AOC in terms of her policies, in terms of her messaging, in terms of just about everything she does. I will say I appreciated that this seemed like a sincere effort on her part to understand where the people in her district are at. She basically asked a question on Instagram. She does make good use of social media. I think that's very fair to say. And then she shared some of the responses she got from people saying how it could be that they supported Donald Trump but also support her. And the answers were interesting, and I think she also found them interesting. You know, it's not actually that surprising. There is a whole lot of people out there who liked Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, who want the establishment taken on, who want working class politics, don't think the Democratic Party is going to deliver on that. Maybe they don't even think Donald Trump is going to deliver on that either, but they're so dissatisfied with the Democratic Party, they want to send a message, but they think AOC talks a lot about these issues, is better on them. So I can absolutely see why some people, and then of course there's the Israel issue. If you're a progressive leftist person who thinks Gaza is a genocide and want to send a message to the Democratic Party that you cannot support Joe Biden and Kamala Harris given what they have facilitated, then that's how you end up voting for AOC and leaving the top blank, or even voting for Donald Trump. As some Muslim people in Michigan, he got endorsed by the mayor of Hamtramck, and he got Jill Stein also got a lot of the vote in Dearborn, but so did Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, on the Gaza question, AOC came out in for a lot of criticism from the left for not being strident enough, as they saw it, in opposing the Biden-Harris administration's policies. But look, I basically agree with the case you just laid out, except I would be more prone to defend AOC in general terms. But look, I think that what she was doing there, firstly, was sincere. And I think there is obviously a substantial body of opinion in this country that is extremely dissatisfied with the status quo. Dissatisfied for good reason in a lot of ways. And obviously, if that is your overall position, you are going to be drawn to candidates who are proposing fairly fundamental change to that status quo. Now, the policy prescriptions that AOC and Donald Trump would have in that respect are vastly different. But the overall sentiment that the country needs not merely to be sort of tweaked around the edges, but sort of grinded into a very different direction, I think does supply some common ground, as it did in 2016 when there was this phenomenon that you're talking about, Bernie Sanders primary voters becoming Donald Trump general election voters.
Do you think AOC has moderated since first coming to Congress, or has chosen a different communication strategy? Because this was someone who came up through democratic socialist policies. I mean, that's a phrase we don't even hear that much anymore. I think they've been so utterly defeated in terms of the attention they get and their organizing and the mood of the country. But she was someone who was a radical, who would really, she beat out a high-ranking member of the Democratic House caucus, and I think since then has kind of slotted herself into the establishment to at least some degree. She doesn't seem to have that same level of combativeness with, for instance, Nancy Pelosi that she had at the beginning, where Nancy Pelosi said, AOC represents not a real sentiment in the country, and fighting with the squad. I don't know, has the squad just become normalized into regular Democratic politics? What's your perspective?
So the way I see that is, I think AOC herself has become a bit less antagonistic to the Democratic establishment. And it was very notable to me this past year, she was one of the most defensive people of President Biden when he was in that whole crisis that ultimately led to him withdrawing from the race. And then she did endorse in a pretty wholehearted way Kamala Harris and went to campaign for her. I found the defensiveness of Biden very peculiar coming from AOC's position, because if you think about the squad, or indeed progressive politics, democratic socialists in general, they're all about this idea that no, you don't settle, you stand up for your ideals, you press forward, you don't let these sort of weak incrementalists kind of water things down. And to go from that position to a sort of like, well, Biden's kind of the best we can do, seemed a very strange position for her to get into.
I've actually already forgotten how defensive of Biden the left and the Squad people were at that time. You're right that it was odd. I attributed it to two things. One being that, while I disagree with leftist people, there is a commitment to even small d democratic procedures, which I think maybe they felt like swapping him out at that point was going to be violating those that norm, that ethos. And also that I think they expected the Kamala Harris foreign policy or Israel policy to be just as brutal and then some. This was, I think, their prediction, and they probably would have been correct, but then they felt no choice but to endorse her when the swap was made.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The only person that I can think of in the Squad who stood out against that was Rashida Tlaib, who I don't believe ever did endorse Harris, although she appeared in campaign events, but then, if I'm recalling correctly, endorsed down ballot people. I think it is going to be interesting to see whether, if I correctly perceive AOC to be becoming less antagonistic, I'm curious what her ambitions are, because even this thing that we're talking about the Trump voters is, I mean, I think it's an honourable thing to do, and I think that she explained on Instagram that she was not trying to ask people, for example, what news sources they look to as a way to belittle them or to deride them. And so it's curious if she is trying to present herself as someone who can channel that anger in the country, perhaps either to the Senate, which would be the automatic next step up, or I don't rule out the possibility of an AOC presidential run at all. I think she'd struggle to get elected nationwide, but
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible. She is, honestly, she's like one of the only names on the Democratic side who gets, who's talked about in that national presidential context, who is of the left. I find interesting, for as much as there has been a pivot to the left has gotten more positive media attention than it was used to in the last couple of years. The names being discussed for 2028 are Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, Pete Buttigieg, maybe Gavin Newsom to some degree, although I've never really understood the appeal. He is very liberal in a way that makes liberals annoyed, and
right. And a very, very stereotypical rich guy from California.
Right, but for the most part, you're talking about people who are trying to moderate the image of the Democratic Party, who I think will do even more of that over the next 4 years. And then you have AOC, who is, we're talking about some changes in how she presents herself, but is still certainly a figure of, at least of the progressive movement, if she's not hard Democratic socialist left, way more progressive than those other names.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously Bernie Sanders is the age he is. Elizabeth Warren is not Sanders' age, but of a different generation to AOC. You have AOC there, 35, charismatic. Yes, lots of people hate her, but lots of people love her. We've seen, I guess, with Trump, most notably, how that can actually work in a political sense. The fact that lots of people dislike you is not necessarily a massive hindrance, as long as an equal or slightly greater number of people love you. And, you mentioned social media. She's a very good fit for a new kind of politics. She obviously has an enormous social media following. So, as I say, I think, do I see her easily, carrying Pennsylvania? I have a little bit of difficulty with that, but I think she would be a credible candidate if she ran.
Well, we will find out. Stay tuned for a lot more coming up on Rising. We are going to be discussing a meeting taking place between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. That's happening right now. Stay tuned.